one of the best ways to establish a core network of acquaintances, friends, and supporters to go to Brazil for 1 or 2 weeks for total immersion, language, and cultural training. The best time to do this is after you've completed your initial business plan, but before you make any formal contacts in Brazil to implement that plan. Be sure to choose training which includes immersion in the special language of your business or profession, as well as in core conversational Portuguese. Then for 1 or 2 weeks, while you're learning Portuguese, you'll also be accessing business and social networks. If you make it known that you're interested in introductions for business purposes, as well as for practicing your language skills, you'll be cordially welcomed into many different networks within the city where you're going through training, all because you are enrolled in immersion training. This market entry strategy isn't for every company, but it is perhaps the most cost-effective way for individuals and small, personally owned and managed U.S. companies to make solid initial business contacts in Brazil and to gain the immeasurable competitive advantage of speaking at least conversational level Portuguese. There simply is no single more cost-effective way for you to build a core network of friendships and relationships and to obtain influential preliminary introductions and to gain a strong competitive advantage over all other non-Portuguese speaking business seekers, including your very strong European and Asian competition. Brazil has historically been a society with a relatively small, very wealthy elite and a complex social order based on poor classes based on color and other ethnic dimensions. Class, race, economic opportunity, access to education and other resources, all of these are long-standing issues in Brazilian society. It's important for Americans going to Brazil for the first time to withhold judgment until we understand more of what we're seeing, until we understand where today's Brazilian society came from, what efforts have been made already, and what problems seem to withstand solution, and why. One extremely important thing for Americans to understand about race and human relations in Brazil is that while African people were brought as slaves to both America and to Brazil, the relationship between the races after slavery ended has been very different in our two societies. Brazilians, for example, have never been officially segregated by race, nor was there ever any significant segregationist political movement. Of course, race and color are at the heart of many difficult and painful social issues in Brazil today, just as they are in much of American society, and in fact elsewhere. But it's important to see some of the subtle differences in how race relations have evolved in Brazil. On a personal and a social level, if not completely on an economic and political level, accommodation between the races rather than conflict, and assimilation rather than segregation are the overall themes of race relations in Brazil. The implications of this fundamental difference in race relations for the marketing of everything from consumer goods to computer hardware cannot and should not be overestimated. Brazilian market demographics must be viewed from a Brazilian perspective. With a clear understanding of some of these subtle but important differences in how market segments are defined, many U.S. businesses will have an important marketing opportunity in Brazil. One of your best resources for this kind of specific information is your local International Small Business Development Center, as well as the U.S. and Foreign Commercial Service offices in Brazil.
In fact, you may have multiple partner opportunities because the market is so large that somebody that you may do a deal with in Sao Paulo, they're not the appropriate party for Rio, and likewise, they're not the appropriate party to do a deal in Belém or Recife in the north. So you really have got your homework cut out for you in terms of figuring out who to do a deal with and where.
There are few pieces of advice more important than the advice that you establish good chemistry. And establishing good chemistry is a matter of mastering a few subtle understandings and then putting them to work. Human relations has developed in a unique historic context in Brazil, quite unlike any other society in the Americas, and very unlike our own. Understanding what these differences are leads directly to greater business skills in areas which depend upon mutual understanding, comprehension, and insight. And this includes just about the entire core of Brazilian business. One big difference is that the U.S. was settled by people determined for the most part to reduce and reject class differences, and developed in a frontier atmosphere which encouraged and even demanded equality and informality. Brazil, on the other hand, was settled by people who transferred and maintained essentially intact an entire set of social and economic class structures, privileges, and relationships which were themselves unique within Europe, and then established these social and economic class concepts as the continuing basis for their New World society. Another major area of difference is that the U.S. had a revolution about throwing off ideas of privilege and class, and we had a civil war about throwing off ideas of race, while Brazil has had neither. Instead, Brazil has developed as a society which stresses accommodation and working things out between different races and classes, while maintaining, rather than trying to eliminate, the underlying social, class, and economic hierarchies with their enormous differences in wealth, privilege, and power. Now, I understand that no brief summary of Brazilian racial and social class relations can be fair or accurate. This brief mention of a complex subject is to point out that these are complex issues in Brazil, and that an American business person or professional will have to achieve a certain level of understanding of this aspect of Brazil in order to be effective and successful.
Brazil has got an extremely paternalistic labor system where, in essence, you cannot terminate or fire an employee. And in order to do that, in essence, you have to pay what's called a severance indemnification to terminate the relationship. Well, American companies have the greatest difficulty understanding that they, in effect, have to pay to terminate the relationship. Now, the good news is the rules of the game are very, very well known. You can sit down and you can learn what it's going to cost to ultimately terminate somebody. But it's one that the system it functions well, it provides a social net, and it's simply an item that you have to add to the cost of doing business in Brazil.
Power and privilege are very closely guarded in Brazilian culture, and people in organizations treat information as power and access as privilege. So obtaining either power or access without knowing the right people can be very difficult, if not downright impossible. This means that the formality which you may encounter up front probably comes from an uncertainty about who you are, what you mean or imply, and whether you're a suitable person to do business with. It comes from a deep cultural background which teaches its members to do business with, make friends with, and marry people from families you know. You'll find that when you come introduced in Brazil by a mutual friend, you will be received in a very different way than the formal politeness which will greet a casual, unknown business caller. Now, whether you come well introduced or whether you're taking the very real chance of calling without an introduction, you'll be graciously received in most Brazilian offices. It's important from the beginning of your Brazilian experience, however, to understand that Brazilians operate on a different sense of time from most Americans, which is not to raise stereotypes of lazy tropical people with bananas on their heads. What I mean is really quite simple in practical terms. In Brazil, don't try to schedule more than one or at a maximum 2 appointments for every morning and afternoon. And anywhere in Brazil this applies. There are several very good reasons for this. For one thing, it's common in Brazil for an official or for someone dispensing regulatory permission to meet with several people at the same time. Now, the people in the room may or may not have had different appointment times, but they're all there with an appointment, just like you. To an American, this may look like chaos, and you may want your business dealt with privately and in sequential order, perhaps with some priority attached to it. But this won't happen. So just relax and try to understand the system that is being used, rather than concluding that there is no system. The system in use, in this case, is one of strong deference to hierarchy, it's one of display of power, and it's also participation in a kind of group bonding. Every person in the room has some kind of a rank-order relationship with the bureaucrat everybody's waiting to see, including some who may have no relationship. And each person's business is going to be dealt with according to their rank. What can you do to improve the situation? The only reason that you're going to find yourself in such a stand-and-wait situation is if your business is not seen as important enough by the VIP you're meeting with. How to improve your ranking? It's quite simple. An introduction from a respected third party or a referral from an organizational superior will both work extremely well.
You look at the population size of Brazil, it's in excess of 130 million people. Immediate reaction to an American is, my God, I've got 130 million consumers out there, and I'm going to zero in on them, and this is going to be easy. Well, it's not quite that easy. There are two Brazils in a sense, and that's what I call the economically active population, and then the rest. The economically active population pretty much lives like middle-class America does in the sense of purchasing power, their desires, their tastes. They're very familiar with American products and services. That's likely the market that you're going to be targeting and you're going to be servicing. The problem is, if you as an American businessman go down to Sao Paulo, get off the plane, you may not necessarily see or find that market. But I can assure you the right Brazilian partner is going to help you to identify that market, come up with a plan to serve it, and then help you to put the plan into implementation. So it really is critical. Find that right person. Now, how do you do this? Well, you can go through the traditional sources. You can work through the commercial attaché office of the U.S. Embassy and the various consulates, and they are going to be helpful. One that you really need to invest some time, there are, during the course of the year, any number of world-class business fairs in Brazil. Typically, most of them take place in Sao Paulo since it's the commercial heart of the country. It's worth going down, reserving space, and spending time. Why? The crowds that these industrial fairs draw are very, very large. There is definitely interest on the part of the business people that attend these fairs, and inevitably some very, very good contacts come out of them.
If you go to Brazil with the idea of cruising through offices, picking up information, holding brief meetings, and wrapping up your business efficiently, then please don't waste your time and money even going to Brazil. Any significant meeting you have in Brazil, and often even minor meetings, will have to begin with a civil, pleasant conversation in which one of two things will probably happen. If you have any friends in common, there's going to be an exchange of news about these mutual friends. So if you're going to Brazil with an introduction from a mutual friend, do not fail to call the person who's given you this introduction and catch up on the latest news of them and their family just before you leave for Brazil. Because if you show up with a letter of introduction from a close friend, but you don't know what your supposedly close friend and his wife did for their anniversary last month, you're going to embarrass yourself and radically reduce the effectiveness of your introduction. Now, if you don't happen to have anyone in common with the person you're meeting with, no letter of introduction, you will still engage in a pleasant civil conversation during which you're almost certainly going to be asked about yourself, your family, your business, and perhaps even your ideas or your opinions on a couple of unrelated matters. It's very important you go into each of these casual conversations in Brazil prepared to use them as the one-time business opportunities which they really are. This means having several good conversational ploys ready. And the very best ploy you can have is if you've gone to the trouble to find out something about the person and their business, and if you can ask an intelligent question or two. Believe me, there are few things you can do which will give you greater immediate advantage in every meeting you have in Brazil than going to the trouble to find out something about the people you'll be meeting with and preparing in advance to ask them intelligent questions about themselves, their family, and their personal interests.